Live everywhere.
Daily Kos Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Tuesday, July 23rd, 2019. Ready for another show? Doesn't matter, really. It's happening nonetheless. We'll pretend we're ready. Everything seems to be going just swimmingly. Testing the microphones on Capitol Hill today. Christopher Wray testifying a day ahead of the, I guess, much anticipated Robert Mueller testimony tomorrow. Some people have been anticipating it for some time. I don't know what we're really going to get out of it tomorrow, but we'll see. I'm open to it happening. I'm not going to stand in the way of the progression of time, etc. I think, whatever. We'll go ahead and do it. I have my concerns about what it means for Democrats and oversight and what they really ought to be doing and whether or not they're going to get what they think they need, whatever that might be. I'm just a little, you can hear it probably in the voice. I'm a little tired of we've got to wait for the Mueller report to come out before we decide what the hell we're going to do, and then the Mueller report comes out, and then, I don't know, we got to wait for the Mueller testimony before we decide what we're going to do, and tomorrow there will be Mueller testimony, and I don't know what's going to come next. We got to wait for an engraved invitation from Robert Mueller to do what needs to be done. I'm not certain what the excuse will be next, or whether there even will be one. More and more members of the Democratic caucus in the House signing up for interest in some level of thinking a little bit about maybe talking about the I word as things go forward. And so that's good news. Nearing probably about 100 by the various counts, either people coming out on record and saying the I word out loud. And remember that some of these 95 to 100 people are saying, well, I'm for opening an inquiry into whether or not there ought to be impeachment. And that's not necessarily saying very much, but okay. They don't have to reach their conclusion just yet in order for things to move forward. So we'll give them some room, I guess. And then now we're at the point where I think that we'll hear from Mueller tomorrow that he thinks that we ought to open an impeachment inquiry, and I don't know whether that's a realistic option, whether he's going to come right out and say it or just say, I told you what I told you. I'm not certain how closely he's going to stick to that idea about how his testimony should go. And let's see, on top of all of that, there is now word from the Department of Justice, which I guess is insisting that his testimony stick to his original outline for what he said he was going to give them. That is to say, I will read you my report, more or less, or the conclusions of my report, and go no further than that. The DOJ now claims that it has a role in directing how Mueller testifies and what the scope of his testimony ought to be. I saw yesterday Manu Raju tweeting around a letter from the Justice Department, and I guess here's the screenshot of it available for us to take a look at. Maybe we can read through it. It's not a long letter. See if we can make heads or tails about what this thing actually says. The DOJ warns Mueller that his testimony, quote, must remain within the boundaries of his public report, and anything beyond that would be covered by executive privilege. It states the view that the DOJ believes Mueller's testimony is unnecessary. I mean, I think Mueller stated the view that he believes his testimony is unnecessary. So we'll take a look at this letter here and round up other items in the news from the last couple of days and see if we can't bide our time until until tomorrow when the big day comes, and then we'll decide whether or not we have to be disappointed. We will have to wait, I think, to decide until Thursday, because his testimony won't likely begin until after we are done. That's the way they usually time things on Capitol Hill. But Daily Kos Radio is live now. Nearly forgot Bill's morning tweet for us, and we'll find out what we're supposed to do. We'll take it's like getting a tweet from Putin every morning. So to give us directions of where to take the United States government next. Kagro X, that's me, David Waldman. Hi, how are you? Is now taking bets how long it'll take for Eric to poke his eye out while trying to use an official Trump campaign plastic freedom straw. My guess, says Bill, by Thursday. I think that they could probably put a cork on the end of it like they did for Ruprecht in Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, and thereby prevent a lot of that from happening. Not a lot of you know that what's his name? That guy in Congress, the one who's the porn hitman, who that was a good joke, and I defend that joke, I think. What's his name again? Dan something? I can't even actually remember the guy's name. But anyway, maybe that's how he put out his eye. It is said that he was, in fact, in service to the United States, and we all need to thank him for it, but I have my doubts. Also, Trump died 3 weeks ago. So you never know with these things. I'm not certain why we all fell all over ourselves to get out of that guy's way. Dan Crenshaw, that's his name, and he's a gigantic jerk to almost everyone on almost a daily basis. And I don't see why we all had to, cry over the fact that that his eye patch had a light joke aimed at it. That's of no concern to me. Anyway, and he's proved himself pretty much a jerk. Everybody laid down for him over Boohoo. He had a joke made about him on Saturday Night Live. And I don't know, for whatever reason, ignored that he says plenty for which you can legitimately think he's a jackass. So, no restrictions, no such restrictions on the show. No letter from the DOJ or the Eye Patch Wearers of America or any such organization warning us not to make these comments. So we're going to go ahead with them. All right, back to the DOJ's letter. Who wrote this thing? It's signed on page 2. Bradley, what? Weinsheimer. I'm looking cross-eyed at this thing, trying to figure out what the name is. Weinsheimer, 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 Assistant Deputy Attorney General, Associate Deputy Attorney General. So, he's not a nobody, but I don't know. How would you like to be Robert Mueller and be getting instructions from Bradley Weinsheimer about what you can and can't say? And no word here. Well, let's read the letter. I haven't seen anybody who's digested the letter say what happens if Mueller just decides, I'm not going to have my testimony bound by this thing. I don't know. Although I will say a lot of the difficulty that we've had in enforcing subpoenas and other oversight powers has come from the DOJ declining or indicating that they would eventually decline to prosecute people who ignore subpoenas. And they might not make the same decision here. Oh, no, we absolutely will prosecute something or bring some sort of case. I don't think they could. It would be very interesting, of course. And I guess the claim here would be a violation of executive privilege, for which I don't know. I'm not certain what comes of that. Maybe nothing. Anyway, not just because it would be a bad claim, but because what do you do? What's the remedy for somebody violating executive privilege? It's not a state secret, and there's no trial from which the evidence can be excluded, so I'm not certain. Well, I don't know. Mueller's probably mulling it over right now. Haha. Okay. Well, anyway, here is the letter. Dear Mr. Mueller, I write in response to your July 10th, 2019 letter. I guess he wrote to them, huh? Concerning the testimonial subpoenas you received from the House Judiciary Committee. I guess he went by the book. When the Judiciary Committee subpoenaed him, he sent a letter to the Department of Justice and said, just thought you should be aware that we got these things. I have these subpoenas and I'm going to comply. Okay. Your letter requests that the department provide you with guidance concerning privilege or other legal bars applicable to potential testimony in connection with those subpoenas. On May 29, 2019, with the department's authorization, you made a public statement about your work as special counsel. You did. I remember that. In that statement, you addressed a possible appearance before Congress, saying that you, quote, hope and expect this to be the only time I will speak to you in this manner, unquote. You also stated that if you testify before Congress, Quote, any testimony from this office would not go beyond our report. It contains findings and analysis and the reasons for the decisions we made. We chose those words carefully, and the work speaks for itself. I guess it didn't. The report is my testimony. I would not provide information beyond that which is already public in any appearance before Congress. Unquote. I understand that subsequently you advised the committee that you do not wish to testify concerning your work as special counsel, given that you would not add anything beyond what you already said in the now public report and your public statement. As the Attorney General has repeatedly stated, the decision to testify before Congress is yours to make in this case, but the department agrees with your stated position that your testimony should be unnecessary under the circumstances. The department generally does not permit prosecutors such as you to appear and testify before Congress regarding their investigative and prosecutorial activity. In addition, the department already has taken extraordinary steps to make almost your entire report, as well as a substantial volume of your underlying investigative material, available to the committee. Should you testify, the department understands that testimony regarding the work of the special counsel's office will be governed by the terms you outlined on May 29th, specifically that the information you discussed during your testimony appears in and does, quote, not go beyond the public version of your March 22nd, 2019 report to the Attorney General or your May 29th public statement. Please note that there should be no testimony concerning the redacted portions of the public version of your report, which may not be disclosed because of applicable laws, court rules, and orders, including Federal Rule of Criminal Procedure 6E, with which we're also familiar, or long-standing department policies. As you know, the U.S. v. Stone and U.S. v. Concord cases remain pending, and local court rules and specific orders issued in those cases substantially restrict the department's ability to make public statements about those cases. In addition, it is the department's long-standing policy not to discuss the conduct of uncharged third parties, like the president. See Justice Manual, Section 9-27.760. Established department policy also precludes any comment on the facts developed and legal conclusion by the special counsel's office with respect to uncharged individuals, other than information contained within the portions of your report that already have been made public, which I guess would mean that he won't say I meant for my report to be a call for impeachment, and that they don't want him to anyway. I mean, they never did, obviously, and he never wanted to do it either, and so together they don't want to at the same time. Finally, any testimony must remain within the boundaries of your public report because matters within the scope of your investigation were covered by executive privilege, including information protected by law enforcement, deliberative process, attorney work product, and presidential communication privileges. These privileges would include discussion about investigative steps or decisions made during your investigation not otherwise described in the public version of your report. Consistent with standard practice, department witnesses should decline to address potentially privileged matters, thus affording the department the full opportunity at a later date to consider particular questions and possible accommodations that may fulfill the committee's legitimate need for information while protecting executive branch confidentiality interests. I trust this information is helpful. It's not. Please do not hesitate to contact me if you wish to further discuss these issues. I don't. Sincerely, Bradley Weisenheimer, or whatever the hell his name is. It's Weinsheimer, Associate Deputy Attorney General. So, a lot of legal speak. Basically, no speculation on criminal liability, which I'm sure will be a question, and it'll be asked by a number of people because of the format we've chosen for these stupid hearings, but who knows what they'll develop between today and tomorrow for dealing with this. Essentially, it is a don't talk about President Trump and what you meant for Congress to do with this report with regard to President Trump kind of a letter. I wonder whether if he's asked now about issues pertaining to the Michael Cohen case, which have now been made public, which might have been redacted from the original release of the report because it was still an ongoing matter with these things under seal by the court and then since released to the public. I'm wondering whether there will be any questions about that and any attempts to keep that testimony, if the subject is broached, outside of the scope of what's allowable. And again, big question here is, suppose Mueller goes beyond. What exactly happens? I don't really know. I don't know what mechanism there is for making him regret it in one way or another. And not much opportunity. There aren't any real forums out there available right now to the DOJ to even to block consideration of information that has gotten out of the bag, either inadvertently or purposefully, from Mueller's testimony. I don't know. I guess we'll wait and see. And you'll have to until tomorrow and then a little bit after, when they try and figure out what the hell it is they want to do about these things. All right, let's see. There's more about what to expect, I suppose, and what sorts of things might come of this testimony. I did note this morning that there was some, let's see if we can find this thing, some discussion this morning about news articles trumpeting the big legislative push, whatever that might be. Where's the original tweet here? I have Chris Megarian's tweet for the Los Angeles Times reporter in Washington covering the Trump investigation and the Russia angle on it. Keep an eye out, he says, for a big legislative push by House Democrats after Robert Mueller's testimony. New details here. And he's referring to his Los Angeles Times piece on the subject. We might take a look at it and see what sort of information Democratic leadership is conveying to him here. There's not a great deal of hope for passing these bills because, of course, if they're the idea of the House Democratic Caucus, though they'll float in the House, they'll have a hell of a time in the Senate, and even if they somehow manage to get through the Senate, who knows what the president would do with them. But let's see what they have in mind. Chris Megarian has written this up, as I mentioned, in the LA Times. Although some Democrats want to use former special counsel Robert S. Mueller III's testimony on Wednesday to spark impeachment hearings, which they could have done the other day just fine on their own, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi hopes to lay the groundwork for legislation to address issues raised by the Russia investigation. There is some room for that, of course. I don't know that everything can be addressed entirely by legislation, but it seems like an interesting idea. It is Congress, of course. This is what they do. Her team is preparing a wave of measures that would likely be introduced after the August recess that starts Friday. So a fantastic way to capitalize on the big news day coming tomorrow. We will wait until September to tell you what we thought of that thing that everybody's attention was supposedly going to be focused on tomorrow. Doesn't sound like much of a plan, does it? But I suppose if you're really thinking of specifically tailoring a legislative push to what is actually said tomorrow, then I guess it's not something that you could have available tomorrow. On the other hand, he has said that he has said that there's not going to be any new revelations, that the report contains everything he plans to say in his testimony. If he's true to his word there, then you should have been able to read the report some time ago and prepare a legislative response and have been ready to announce them more or less immediately after his testimony, unless there are any surprises, in which case, fine, reserve the right to update at some point in the future. Anyway, the article continues, we hope that hearing from Mueller will spark a sense of urgency to do something. Yeah, that'd be a nice hope to have. said this from a senior Democratic leadership aide who requested anonymity to discuss the caucus's plans. Mueller is scheduled to testify for 5 hours on Wednesday. Some of the ideas for new legislation are intended to prevent what Democrats have described as abuses of power. For example, the Mueller report said President Trump asked Donald McGahn, his White House counsel, to draft a false document saying he was never asked to fire the special counsel. Yes, that among one of my favorite LOL, YOLO, nothing matters moments in the Mueller report. And I guess that will engender some discussion tomorrow, too, right? Just in case you missed what we're talking about. President Trump asked Don McGahn to draft a false document saying he was never asked to fire the special counsel. Democrats want a measure to specifically prohibit such steps, and they want to limit presidential influence over law enforcement decisions. Okay. Sure. Other ideas under consideration have already been in circulation, such as requiring campaigns to report foreign offers of assistance. Now, the people perpetrating the illegal activity will have to turn themselves in or face criminal liability for not doing that. Not only for the things that they're doing, but not telling on themselves. That ought to straighten it out. I mean, it's an extra charge you can hit them with. Fantastic. I mean, if you ever catch anybody doing it again, whatever, and they're not pardoned by the president or whatever else you might do. What other complications might there be? During the 2016 campaign, Trump's eldest son accepted a meeting with a Russian lawyer after being told she wanted to help provide political dirt on Hillary Clinton. You remember that, of course. The meeting, which was also attended by several top campaign aides, did not result in any criminal charges. Democrats have struggled to advance legislation that they say is necessary to safeguard future elections from foreign interference, like what Russia deployed in 2016. The House last month passed a measure known as the SAFE Act, which would have sent more money to states to beef up election security, but it remains stalled in the Republican-controlled Senate. No matter what you think about obstruction, no matter what you think about conspiracy, there are gaps in our election security, said another Democratic aide. Well, that's all true. Likely to remain true. There was some additional commentary on this idea of keeping an eye out for this fantastic raft of bills. And, you'd be forgiven for being somewhat skeptical of the ability of the Democratic House to pass any of these things, or whether they'd even be effective measures even if they were passed. My only thought on it at first was, Republicans, specifically the White House and Trump's counsel, keep claiming that there is no legitimate legislative purpose to what the Democrats are pursuing in the House. And I suppose this is one way of trying to answer that, saying, here is some legislation that I don't know, it's a weird way of emphasizing this. Here's some legislation, though. Here's some legislating that we're doing right now that seems to have been drawn, or is at least designed to have been drawn from some of the information we're seeking, at least from Robert Mueller, and maybe also from some other of the subpoenas we've issued. You wanted a legislative purpose? Well, here it is. And that, it might answer that objection. That objection doesn't actually have to be answered, and I guess it's a coin toss as to whether or not you were strategically better off saying, no, it doesn't need to be answered, and we're so sure that it doesn't need to be answered that we haven't even bothered to answer it. That can play differently in different courts. It depends on who you're talking to, I guess. Then, of course, there's also the option of saying, well, of course there's legitimate legislative interest in it. Here it is. Here's some bills. And that would answer anybody, I guess, who really thought that it was necessary to show a legitimate legislative interest. I don't know that it would have been, I don't know how wise it is to concede the point that, sure, there has to be one, but that's a strategic decision for the lawyers. There was another good point made in the discussion, I thought, although I don't know that it's so applicable to this particular legislation and this kind of legislation. But Brett Banditelli, who many of you know from the internets as a very active political organizer, pointed out for us here, it's important to pass bills now, even in the House, even if they're rejected by the Senate. It's important to pass these, well, not these bills, but bills in general now, because it puts pressure on the legislature to pass them when we control all three arms of government. That's interesting thought, right? We saw this at the state level with minimum wage and wage theft and voting rights bills. Much of the legislation was passed when we just held the House. And then when we held everything, centrists always tried to squirrel their way out of voting for it, but came around to it because they had already voted for it. So Republicans can still message it against them, and donors can still hold it against them, of course. But a good point there. I think that if you can convince Democrats to vote as a unified caucus now, even when it doesn't matter, and even though it's not likely to become law, then at least they're on the record as having been for it. They enjoyed all the positive press of it. They issued the press releases, etc. And then when it can really count and when it can really become law and they start to invent reasons to back out of their prior commitment, you at least have in your arsenal the ability to show them that they have voted for it on the record in the past and should be embarrassed not to support it now. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. I guess to the extent that it does, great, those things will be passed. But I don't think that election protection and declaring yourself an agent of the Russian Federation are the sorts of things that moderates have been shying away from, really. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, with a brand new interruption to say thanks to all of you who support the show. Remember when I told you that our average monthly donation was about $7, for which you were getting 2 great hours of news and entertainment 5 days a week, and how that came out to about 70 cents an hour? That's a pretty good deal. Except it's wrong. The math actually works out closer to 17 cents an hour. It is hard to beat a deal like that, and even harder to send your kids to college on. Thankfully, Patreon.com makes it easy to make that work. Patreon, Patreon.com, is the simple, secure way to make recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Just search for me or the show name on the site, and they make it easy to crowdfund the show so that the power of our numbers can keep the show going for just a few bucks a month. Once again, thanks so much for all your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. So we closed out the prior segment by saying, I very much appreciate the point that Brett was making, that wage bills and the like, policy bills outside of the scope of the Trump-Russia investigations, etc. I find, that's a great point, and probably a great strategy to keep in mind. Again, and so that applies to the various messaging bills that we've been disdainful of here on the show and elsewhere. This is a good redeeming point. You pass these things now and use the leverage of the fact that it doesn't matter, just now, and that it's a messaging bill and it's for setting up Democrats generally to be in the best, strongest position possible in the next upcoming elections, and you can get otherwise wishy-washy or wavering Democrats to sign on to the effort and pass the thing because it doesn't matter now, only to be able to hit them again later on when it does matter and they're looking for ways out to say, look, you're already on record as supporting this thing. You might as well just go ahead and do it. You've already been attacked on it and you survived. You're here. So what are you worried about? And that's true. That's a good point. However, for one thing, the election protection bills, I think, are of a different class. And even the moderate to conservative Democrats are more than happy, not just for messaging purposes, but more than happy to sign on to the purpose of these bills. And they won't need that additional push of reminding them. Oh, pardon me, as we back off the microphone a little bit here from that pop. They won't need that additional push to vote for it. Well, we hope anyway. I guess never put anything past these guys. And that's always a good warning, too. Anyway, I thought a good point, certainly, from Brett, and well worth putting in your legislative arsenal, right? Keep it in mind as a tactic for the future. Hopefully we won't be stuck in the minority again in either of the two legislative houses, but eventually it's coming, as you know. And well worth thinking about. All right, let's see. Other discussions of the upcoming Mueller testimony that might need to be briefed before we head into tomorrow. I guess we don't actually need to read through this thing. I kept this article from yesterday that Armando referred to, the Monday piece about Nadler saying that there was substantial evidence that Trump committed high crimes and misdemeanors. I mostly kept kept for reference to the fact that Mueller and others on the committee were attempting to talk the leadership into having Al Green's impeachment resolution referred to committee. There were once again doubters out there on Twitter and the internet. There were people who were wrong on the internet who said that the only options available were to either directly proceed to impeaching the president and voting this article of impeachment out and reporting it to the Senate and beginning the trial, or voting to table it. And that's just because they've never seen anything else done with resolutions like this. It's either table or move ahead, and that's because that's the choice that's presented to you by the leadership. They use their ability to get recognized in priority and make the first motion as to what to do with this thing. If the first person who rises to address the resolution, besides the author of the resolution, of course, who's calling up a privileged motion, but if the leadership rises and is recognized first to say, well, I move that we table this thing, then the vote's on tabling. If the first person to rise moves that it be referred to committee, then the vote is on moving it to committee. It's just that they opt, because it gives them maximum relief from the pressure of dealing with impeachment, they opt to make a motion that the resolution be tabled rather than referred. And I know it's not much discussed even on the show about when it comes to procedure, but there are rules in the House about the priority given to the majority and minority leaders. The Speaker of the House, should she opt to speak from the floor, and their designees, as well as the authors of bills. But there are rules about the priority with which they'll be recognized if they rise to speak, if they rise to seek recognition, such that if Steny Hoyer, in his capacity as majority leader, rises on the floor at the same time to speak as any other rank and file member of the House, Democrat, Republican, or otherwise, the chair is meant to recognize the majority leader first, and that gives him the opportunity to make the first motion that it be tabled, even if somebody else, even if Al Green or some other impeachment supporter rises to make the motion, Jerry Nadler, for that matter, rises to make the motion that it be referred to committee. Hoyer would be recognized prior to Nadler. The motion would be made, and then if there is sufficient second for the motion, that's the pending question. You can't say, well, hold on a second, I was going to move that it be referred to my committee. Yeah, well, okay, you can go next. If there's a bill pending, which if the vote to table the bill carries, there would not be, Actually, it's a resolution and not a bill. We should use the precise language. But that's how they deal with that. That's why there was no motion to refer it to committee. The leadership, which has the priority in recognition, had already decided that what they were going to do with their preferred recognition was move to table. So there you have it. But anyway, I just wanted to hold on to an article that acknowledges that, yes, that is absolutely a motion that can be made. There were literally a lot of people out there that believed that that was not a possibility, that you simply couldn't make that motion because they've never seen that motion made with respect to things like this. And leadership told reporters that in all likelihood they would be moving to table it, and all of the reporting said that there would be a motion to table, and none of it said, oh, by the way, there was an other option here. They're just deciding not to take it. And, that's where people's information comes from. And so they think that that's all that there was available to it. It's an interesting study in the way, there was nothing factually untrue about the way the bill or the resolution was reported on here. That was what was going to happen. There was going to be a motion to table, and that would essentially kill the resolution, and that would be the end of it. And no one was talking about the possibility of referring it because that wasn't what they intended to do, and they also didn't really want people to know that that was a possibility. And why should you waste any time on it anyway, since that's not the motion we're going to make? And as a result, you get a half-informed journalism community, half-informed media, and half or less informed readership or consumers of the media anyway, depending on how they get it. Okay. So I thought that was of some interest. There is another piece here that was of some interest as well, a Politico piece. Let's take a look at this one. How Congress can exploit Mueller's legal mistakes. I thought, let's look into some of this. And it doesn't appear to be a piece about how they can, for instance, undermine his gravitas or the importance of the case that he appears to have laid out in his report. Something different here. Jed Sugarman, who we've, I think, referred to and read from in the past, law professor at Fordham, and among his other credits listed here, author of The People's Courts and co-author of amicus briefs challenging President Trump's emoluments clause violations in his appointment of Matthew Whitaker as Attorney General, which he didn't actually do. All right, how Congress can exploit Mueller's legal mistakes. The investigator made important errors in his Trump report. We ought to find out about those. To make them count on Wednesday, members need to take a lesson from Watergate and hand over the microphone. No indication that they plan to do this, but it's a thought anyway. If recent history is any guide, Robert Mueller's much anticipated, there it is again, see, Capitol Hill appearance on Wednesday will fizzle into a mix of political grandstanding by the questioners and frustratingly narrow answers from the star witness. Congress's biggest public chance to highlight the links between the Trump campaign and Russia, and the president's acts of obstruction will become a chance for members to showcase their wit, score political points, and maybe even go viral with a dramatic exchange. This one was originally scheduled for last week, and the main reason for its delay is that the junior members of the Judiciary Committee wouldn't have enough time to get their own questions in. So far, the solution has been to expand the hearing time. Here's a better one. None of the members should ask the questions at all. I know Armando was fond of this option. Their expert staffers should ask all the questions, not just to resolve the battle of egos, but to give Congress its only chance to make any real progress on the issue. To go by Mueller's previous statements, the hearings aren't likely to turn up new information about the Trump campaign, but they could genuinely change the trajectory of the Trump-Russia story by drawing connections between the report and Mueller's earlier rounds of indictments, and also by highlighting Mueller's legal errors, the opportunities he didn't take, and why he skipped them. I guess open to interpretation as to whether or not they are errors. But here we go. That's only possible with the right format, Sugarman argues. The hearings are almost guaranteed to be a waste of time if they stick to the format of disjointed 5-minute rotating rounds of questions by elected members, which by all indications they will. This format has proved to be a failure in the high-profile hearings of the past 2 years. Time and again, just when a member starts to make headway with the follow-up questions, time runs out. Republican members alternate with Democratic members who have a totally different political agenda. Real progress on the hearings as the hearings continues is rare. Even if the Democratic members agree to ask the same kinds of questions, it is hard for even the best lawyers to follow up on someone else's line of questioning or set up someone else's questions. 2 or 3 expert staff lawyers working together would be the only efficient and effective use of such limited and interrupted time. To have any real hope of getting deeper into the story of Trump and Russia or clarity about Mueller's confusing conclusions, they'll need questioners capable of drilling into complex issues who can professionally but tenaciously grill a respected public figure and highlight his mistakes. I'd like to hear what some of the mistakes are. It may seem surprising to suggest that the Democrats should highlight Mueller's errors, but that should absolutely be a part of their strategy. The report was stunningly wrong, for instance. Dramatic music for that one. They're stunningly wrong. What? On the law of coordination in campaign finance law. The Department of Justice's appointment letter assigned Mueller to investigate campaign coordination. His report stated that coordination does not have a settled definition in federal criminal law. We understood coordination to require an agreement, tacit or express. However, Congress did explicitly aim to avoid such a permissive interpretation. In 2002, Congress passed a statute declaring that campaign finance regulations, quote, shall not require agreement or formal collaboration to establish coordination, unquote. And any knowing and willful violations are criminal. The Federal Election Commission implemented the statute accordingly. Quote, coordinated means made in cooperation, consultation, or concert with, or at the request or suggestion of a candidate, without any requirement to prove agreement. The Supreme Court upheld these coordination rules in 2003. Expenditures made after a wink or nod often will be as useful to the candidate as cash. Mueller's error in interpreting coordination has already had serious consequences. Mueller's team prosecuted Paul Manafort and Rick Gates for separate crimes not directly related to the Trump campaign, but Mueller also found the evidence that these campaign officials committed felony coordination. It was a historic error to overlook such crimes, and effectively inviting the same suggestions and winks and nods in 2020. A formal conclusion that the Trump campaign committed crimes would have made Trump's obstruction more glaring and scandalous. Without such a conclusion, Volume 2 of his report on the obstruction fell flat. Mueller made other legal errors that opened up loopholes for 2020 and beyond, suggesting that all, quote, opposition research might be protected by the First Amendment, and accepting a blanket defense of Manafort, a lawyer and a veteran campaign official or advisor in 4 presidential campaigns, as not having relevant knowledge of these legal issues. If an operative like Manafort can't be assumed to have that knowledge, then who possibly could? On the related facts, there are additional puzzles in the report's omissions. Volume 1 on the campaign in Russia also surprisingly omits key facts that the Mueller team revealed elsewhere in prosecutorial documents, which, when put in context, makes a case for criminal coordination. For example, the Mueller team's indictments of the Russian hackers showed a remarkable coincidence in dates between Trump campaign signals and Russian hacking and leaking efforts, often on the same day or within even hours. But the report itself either failed to note or failed to emphasize most of these. I certainly made it clear about Russia if you're listening, but perhaps there were others. In another tantalizing omission, the Mueller team's indictment of Stone said a senior campaign official was directed to contact Stone about any additional releases and what other damaging information WikiLeaks had regarding the Clinton campaign. Who directed that campaign official? Who was coordinating with Stone? Presumably, these answers are redacted from the report, and Mueller will be reticent. But given the significance to these events, an expert questionnaire might elicit more context. In addition, many prosecutors would have drawn far different inferences from so much circumstantial evidence of wrongdoing and intent. And even if Mueller couldn't indict Trump under OLC policy, P.S., you can, but okay. Why did this policy have a double whammy of not even being able to make legal conclusions and deliberately writing cryptically and sometimes incomprehensibly? Of course, Mueller is unlikely to reveal any information we didn't know before, but the hearing could play the valuable role of drawing connections, correcting errors, and laying out their significance in the public record. Mueller is, rightly, a respected, revered public servant, which makes any aggressive questioning like a cross-examination along these lines risky and awkward. He and his office professionally uncovered a president's crimes, his campaign's crimes, won a stunning number of convictions in a short period of time under tremendous political pressure and interference. But the Mueller report's legal errors are so significant. How significant are they? They are so significant that the House committees have a duty to press him to correct them through something like cross-examination. Cross-examining such is no simple task. Moreover, Mueller has promised to be such a reluctant witness that any questioning must be done by experienced experts with enough time for follow-ups. Cross-examining a smart and experienced lawyer, and rightly a hero to many, is a hard needle to thread legally and politically, and those complexities underscore the need for members of Congress to step aside and get some expert help. Relying on expert questioners in place of elected officials isn't common, but shouldn't be so unusual. In moments of great national crisis, most notably Watergate and also in the Iran-Contra scandal, members have been willing to concede the spotlight and let more experienced lawyers handle the proceedings. In Watergate, when members of Congress had questions for some of the most high-profile witnesses, or when they knew that the questions would produce bombshells, they didn't keep the airtime for themselves. They graciously and wisely assigned the questioning to the committee counsel and gave them time to probe and follow up. The result felt and worked like a real inquiry, in which trained lawyers followed full lines of questioning until they yielded real information. It was committee staff counsel, such as Sam Dash and Fred Thompson, who asked some of the most historic questions. They questioned White House lawyers H.R. Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, and John Dean. In part because of the committee's savvy use of advance interviews, Thompson's questions of Nixon aide Alexander Butterfield prompted him to reveal on national television the existence of the Oval Office taping system. When Dash asked him who knew about it, Butterfield replied, "The President." Gasps filled the room. In a remarkable example of restraint in the public interest, some of the senators had known the televised questioning of Butterfield was likely to deliver a historic bombshell, and they gave the questions to their staff counsel nonetheless. Staffers asking questions with sufficient time and expertise were pivotal in transforming Watergate from a third-rate burglary to a resignation in the face of impeachment. Something similar happened again during the biggest scandal of the Reagan administration. In 1987, during hearings about illegal arms sales to Iran used to fund the right-wing Nicaraguan Contras, Senate Committee Chief Counsel Arthur Lyman and House Committee Chief Counsel John Nields had led the questioning for 40 days of televised hearing. Imagine that. Most notably, the high-profile interrogation of Colonel Oliver North and Admiral John Poindexter. Lyman's intense questioning got North to admit on national television that CIA Director Casey had ordered him to destroy the notes and records of the illegal arms sales, and that he had indeed shredded those records. This format prevented Lyman to follow up and press North to such an extent that North's attorney, Brendan Sullivan, lost his temper in one of the most famous moments of the hearings, shouting at Lyman, "Get off his back!" Robert Mueller's hearing, obviously, won't yield the kind of information that came from Butterfield or Haldeman during Watergate or Iran-Contra's Poindexter or North. He's not an eyewitness nor a hostile witness in a colloquial sense, but he is a uniquely complicated mix of helpful when it comes to the underlying facts of the presidential crimes and stubbornly reluctant and deliberately unclear when it comes to his and the DOJ's legal positions. The Mueller team's fact-finding is so thorough, so important, and so damning of Trump's criminal behavior that committees need to highlight and emphasize those aspects of his work without the exercise feeling like a partisan gang tackle. Oh well. Whereas the members of Congress might have a hard time maintaining an even tone, veteran litigators might be more likely to keep their cool while keeping up an intense line of questioning. Mueller is rightly a respected, revered public servant, you said that already, which makes any tough questioning akin to cross-examination risky and awkward, and I believe you said that already as well. There is sometimes a risk in delegating questions to staff. In the Kavanaugh hearings, the Senate Republicans looked like they were dodging an awkward situation by handing their questions of a vulnerable-seeming female witness to an outside lawyer. But there isn't the same risk here. The perception, rightly, is that the Democrats are too focused on their own publicity. Delegating is more likely to be seen as unselfish. Maybe. It's a good point. During Watergate, Sam Dash's and Fred Thompson's questions did not make Senator Sam Ervin or Senator Howard Baker look weak. Instead, their professional, incisive questions played a key role in making the hearings a success, which in turn made these senators into legendary figures to this day. Giving it to lawyer staffers actually could reveal the House members' wisdom and lower some of their own potential political risks. And, more importantly, the expert lawyers just might get Mueller to correct some of his errors, fix some of the loopholes, and reveal something that changes the trajectory of the report from dud into bombshell. The House Democrats can treat the hearing like a campaign event, making sure they each have their 5 minutes of airtime with all the risks of that falling flat. Or they have a chance to be remembered more like the Watergate Committee, as wise and effective public servants who stepped back when it mattered for the country. Well, we'll see tomorrow, but yeah, no indication that is in the offing, so you might wonder why waste time speculating about it. And again, just so that you know that there could have been a different format, I guess similar to the discussion of the previous article, just so you know there was another option here, and they made a specific decision to go in a specific direction, probably for a specific reason, which they're not discussing openly just yet. Maybe they never will, but for those of you collecting circumstantial evidence that Pelosi simply wants to do anything she can to avoid serious discussion of the I word, maybe this is a case for your files. Okay. Let's see. A bit more pending here and another break coming up. Let's see. There are a few things of some length that need some discussion, and we'll perhaps save those for later, but I guess we can do 2 quick hits here before we exit for the moment. Let's see. The first, just shifting gears entirely here, a tweet of some note about a comment of some note. The tweet comes from Jeff Merkley, of course, Senator from Oregon, commenting on the, believe it or not, another comment of some consequence, lousy, horrible, horrific consequence, made by the orange dotard Donald Trump, allegedly President of the United States. How long is this clip? It's 2 minutes of video, but we don't need to play all the way through this. But this one caught some attention yesterday. I don't know who it was that the president was sitting with here, but he makes reference to the situation in Afghanistan. MSNBC's tweet is the one that Jeff Merkley uses to comment off of. MSNBC's tweet reading, "Watch this video. President Trump says that he could win the 18-year Afghan war in 10 days. Probably even less than that. 10 days, because he has plans that could, well, wipe Afghanistan off the face of the earth and kill 10 million people. Hooray. But, quote, I don't want to go that route. Oh, yeah? That's a interesting thing to say, to, war crimes, mass genocide, etc. And that's what Merkley's point is here. That's not winning. That's genocide. I could win the Afghan war. I have a plan. I could simply nuke the place and kill everybody in it. And then the war there would be over. Oh, but P.S. I don't actually want to do that. Oh, thanks. I'm glad you cleared that one up. Yeah, that's remarkably irresponsible thing to say. I mean, we all know that could happen. It's just one of those things that the president is not supposed to say out loud for fear of frightening everyone in the world. I mean, there are rules about saying these things for the rest of you. Like, for instance, there are ways. I don't have plans for it. You're not going to see me planning for such a thing. There are weirdos out there who are willing to do such things, and they're horrific people. But there are ways that in 10 days or less, for instance, you could be done with the Trump presidency. He could just not be president anymore. Various plans with various outcomes. We're just saying those plans typically are not discussed aloud, and for good reason. They are illegal in most cases. Of course, you could get an impeachment done really quickly in 10 days. I suppose that's always possible. But basically what he's saying here is, well, I could win the war by killing millions and millions of people. But thanks for letting us know that you're opting not to go that route. And Jeff Merkley calling it out as correct here. That's not winning the war. That's just a bunch of murder. Genocide, of course. Actually quite true. That, and I guess we will take note of the fact that the White House took note of the fact that we were taking note of the fact yesterday after the show and on Twitter that it has been 3 weeks since we were told by Mike Pence's chief of staff that we would find out in a few weeks why Mike Pence turned around and came home, or rather back to the White House, instead of continuing on to his event in New Hampshire that day Trump dropped dead 3 weeks ago. Well, we found out. There's a news article. I'll share it with you after the break, but I guess they heard me reminding them that it had been 3 weeks and moved into action. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show on Netroots Radio. We'll let the music roll a little bit longer there as we struggled with the mute button. Here I have the reporting from Politico that tells us, as I said, largely in response to my tweet, which was actually pretty popular and caught on pretty quickly. I don't know whether they were planning to come out with the explanation yesterday or not. I mean, it is possible that they had the thing ready and in pocket, and maybe they were just going to say, well, let's just ignore it forever until somebody actually calls us out, and maybe part of the journalistic community happened to see that fly by on their Twitter feed and said, yeah, we should ask that question. So Politico had an answer. Trent Spiner, I'm guessing with one N in his name, had this at 3:19 yesterday afternoon, which actually allowed plenty of time to catch on to the fact that it had in fact been 3 weeks and ask the question. So here's the alleged answer here. And some headline, behind Pence's Air Force 2 cancellation, a drug dealer. Well, that's special. Vice President Mike Pence was one short plane ride away from shaking hands with an alleged interstate drug dealer. Womp womp. We actually have the trombone queued up, but we'll skip it. It hurts my ears. Pence abruptly canceled his trip. That's an interesting way of putting it, too. To Manchester, New Hampshire earlier this month, but never said why he was pulled from Air Force 2 at the last minute. Right there in that one sentence, you see the contradiction. Mike Pence, I very dynamically, abruptly canceled my trip, but I never said why. I was pulled from Air Force 2. He didn't cancel the trip. The White House made him turn around. Okay. Although saying as much, I guess, admits that the White House was, at least for the moment, well, maybe on top of their game isn't exactly the right words. But for this group of people, I guess this is actually being on top of their game. A White House, a normal White House that's really on top of its game just doesn't schedule the event because they vet the people before announcing it and say, no, it's a drug dealer. Not going to have this event. Republican drug dealer, I guess. Who else would he be going to New Hampshire to see? All right, the vice president's aides and even President Donald Trump himself kept up the suspense. You'll know in about 2 weeks. All right, well, that's just funny on two levels. Not the least of which, of course, is that Trump's response to everything is that you'll know in 2 weeks. But what makes it even funnier is, of course, so, when I saw this thing happen yesterday, I had tweeted out, tomorrow marks 3 weeks until they said we would find out in a few weeks, and we haven't found out. And then then they answered right away. And I assumed that they were planning on spending the day being very smug about, we said it would be a few weeks, and it was, in fact, exactly 3 weeks. Not a couple of weeks, like 2 weeks, but a few weeks, like 3 weeks. I don't know. Some people think that makes a difference. But then, of course, Trump just has to come right out and say it. Oh, yeah? Well, I said you would know in 2 weeks, and you didn't. So there you go. How long will it be till we know, Mr. President? 2 weeks. 3 weeks later, we found out that Trump was wrong about that. All right. There was a very interesting problem that they had in New Hampshire, was the second part of his comment on that. Among the problems, was a federal law enforcement probe involving individuals Pence would likely encounter, according to a law enforcement official briefed on the incident, if Pence stepped off the vice presidential aircraft. And it was the plan for him to step off of the vice presidential aircraft. One of the people he would have seen on the ground was under investigation by the Drug Enforcement Administration. Isn't it Drug Enforcement Agency? All right, well, whatever. The DEA for moving more than $100,000 worth, I guess, of fentanyl from Massachusetts to New Hampshire. It's not a long-distance drug smuggling operation. It's just a smuggling operation. Okay. Jeff Hatch, who agreed in federal court Friday to plead guilty and will face up to 4 years in prison, works for an opioid addiction treatment center in southern New Hampshire that Pence was set to visit. A former New York Giants player, he has spoken publicly for years about his own challenge with drug and alcohol addiction, which ended his football career. He has been on stage with Senator Jeanne Shaheen, the Democratic senator from New Hampshire, and is known throughout the state for warning students about the dangers of using drugs. He has been beaten down in the past, but now stands tall in front of audiences to personally share his compelling story, says a listing offering him to speak to groups. Oh, well. And I guess, by the way, he approaches this, as he ought to, as a nonpartisan exercise, I guess. In saying that it was apparently a Republican drug dealer that Pence was getting ready to meet, well, I guess drug dealer still sticks, but maybe the Republican label doesn't necessarily. We don't know. He may very well be a Republican. Anyway, the vice president's office declined to comment, and Pence has declined to discuss the incident. I'm sure they would rather that nobody had asked at all about what happened, even 3 weeks later. The early July event had been billed by his office as a roundtable discussion with former patients and alumni at the Granite Recovery Center headquarters, followed by remarks from Pence on the opioid crisis and illegal drug flow in New Hampshire. The vice president's aides have said they would reschedule his trip to New Hampshire. I suppose that would have been embarrassing to have a roundtable discussion aimed at stopping the flow of drugs into New Hampshire with a guy who was moving drugs into New Hampshire. Federal court documents released Friday said Hatch was caught in 2017 with 1,500 grams of fentanyl. But 2017, that's a long time ago. I mean, comparatively. That this should have gone forward so far, 2 years later, that the vice president would be meeting with him. A baggie of the drug sold on the streets of New Hampshire, the wild streets of New Hampshire, is usually about 1/10 of a gram. And he had not just 1 full gram, but 1,500 of them. That seems like an awful lot, and dangerous at that. Don't we hear every day that, whatever. Anyway. Earlier that year, federal, state, and local police began an investigation into a supplier of drugs flowing into Manchester, New Hampshire, an area hard hit by the opioid epidemic. More than 500 people a year have been dying in New Hampshire for the last several years, and the crisis does not appear to be abating. Federal authorities focused on Hatch. In court documents, they allege Hatch made a call in the early morning hours of July 25, 2017, to arrange a pickup of drugs from a supplier in Lawrence, Massachusetts. He allegedly brought the drugs back to his home in New Hampshire, later distributing smaller amounts to couriers. A law enforcement official said Hatch agreed to help authorities arrest other dealers higher in the food chain in exchange for a more lenient sentence. He was charged with a single count of using a telephone to help commit a crime. According to court records, that seems like a pretty low-grade crime to charge him with. He agreed to be sentenced to up to 4 years in federal prison and a maximum fine of $250,000. Wow, you can get that for using a telephone to help commit a crime? Think you could do something about, using a telephone to change the course of an election, possibly? Maybe not. Scott Murray, the U.S. Attorney for the state, did not return a call about the leniency of the charges. Hatch, it doesn't even sound that lenient, really. Hatch did not return a message left on his cell phone. Hatch, until Monday, was the Chief Business Development Officer for Granite Recovery Centers, which provides treatment for substance abuse, which seems like a contradiction in his life, doesn't it? After this story first published, Granite Recovery Center's CEO Eric Spofford said in a statement, "I am shocked and disappointed to learn today that Jeff Hatch has pled guilty to a drug offense." Granite Recovery Centers terminated Jeff's employment today, immediately upon learning about this matter. 2 months before federal authorities allege he made the big drug pickup, Hatch stood with Senator Shaheen to warn students about drug use, using his personal story. According to WMUR-TV, Hatch told the students he began taking opioids after a back injury in his 20s. For me, that worked, but then I made the realization that if I were able to take a couple more, it would cure emotional pain along with the physical pain. Well, it doesn't. If you suffer from it, talk about it. Let it be known, because that is why we are all here helping. We know it exists, we know it's real, and you are not less than because we have it. At the same time, or at the time, Shaheen said she wanted more funding for programs to help student athletes fight addiction issues. Shaheen said in a statement Monday, Granite Staters seeking recovery from substance abuse disorders put their trust in Mr. Hatch, and it's incredibly disappointing to see how badly that trust was betrayed. He needs to be held accountable. Less than a month ago, Hatch took part in a roundtable with retired Brigadier General Donald Bolduc, who may face a 3-way primary to take on Shaheen. He told the group he has been in recovery for 13 years. The campaign said he did not meet one-on-one with Bolduc. Now everybody has to distance themselves from this guy. Okay, so that may or may not actually be it. I still maintain we'll never know the truth, Trump being dead and all. But at least they were on the ball and responded to, my tweet, I guess. Although it's still pretty funny that Trump said it was going to be 2 weeks and instead it was 3. So he never gets it right no matter what. All right, let's see. Before we head on into other items, let's see. We've got Michael Musson's comment that this would be an effective way to upstage Mueller. Let's find out what it is. Natasha Bertrand tweeting this morning, scoop. It says so right here, scoop. The Trump met with Devin Nunes last week. That's a mistake. To discuss replacements for Director of National Intelligence Dan Coates. In the latest sign, Coates is on his way out. The meeting has top ODNI, Office of the Director of National Intelligence, top officials worried that Nunes himself is in the running for the job. That would be something of a scoop, don't you think? All right. Let's see. Maybe I'll open up that article and keep it for kicks later on, but I guess that probably gets the gist of the article across to us. All right, thanks for that tip. Let's see, what else have we got here? Oh, just a note from Mad Hatter saying that Dan Crenshaw, porn hitman guy, hosted an Ask Me Anything at a bar in Houston where a live band was playing. No one could hear him, and Texas's 2nd District deserved better. All right, well, that's interesting. That's a great ploy. Ask me anything. I held the Ask Me Anything. Just because you couldn't hear anything and neither could I doesn't mean I didn't do it. I'm a very open person. Okay. let's see. A couple of other items to get at. Maybe we ought to start in on one of the lengthier discussions. I don't even know how long it's going to take us, but we'll start in on that and maybe hit a few of the smaller items later on towards the end of the show. Let's see. This I thought was interesting. Happened to see these comments from Brian Beutler responding to our own Taniel on Twitter here. Let me see. Where does this... I say our own because he, at least, I don't know what his current status is. Maybe he's no longer currently writing for Daily Kos Elections. I don't follow that lineup closely enough to know offhand. He doesn't list it at the moment in his Twitter bio here. But anyway, just trying to follow the provenance of the... Where's the best place to start with this? Maybe with Taniel's tweet here and then Brian's answer, although Taniel himself is tweeting in response to Adam Gentleson. You know how these things go. But Taniel's point here, hard to believe anyone could utter such a thing. What is that thing? But we just read that Politico article with prominent Dems decrying the idea of, quote, playing revenge with judicial process, as though it's about revenge rather than protecting equal rights or public services. So, no, I'm not optimistic. Okay, what's going on here? His tweet, as I said, is in response to Adam Gentleson. And his tweet here, Gentleson, former deputy chief of staff for Harry Reid, commenting, I've been asking around for defenses of this deal, and the main rationale being offered is that top Democrats don't think McConnell will weaponize the debt ceiling against a Democratic president in 2021. We saw him block Garland with our own ideas. It's as bad as it looks. So now we got to dig into what was going on here. What the genesis then of this is the emerging deal on, all the finances of the country. Budget, debt ceiling has to be raised. We're going to be running up against the debt ceiling again. And apparently there's a deal in the offing that once again temporarily raises the debt ceiling. And I guess it's targeted at expiring again in right about this time in the year 2021, which means it gets booted past the election and the next president, whether that's Donald Trump or anyone else, has got to deal with it. So that's a frequently used tool on Capitol Hill to try for when they need to appear to be depoliticizing an issue, like the debt ceiling. People like to use this tactic for that issue. Will rather than impose a permanent settlement on the current president, so it doesn't look like we're doing something political, we will kick it past the next election, and then, well, gosh, we'll just roll the dice and let fate, let the chips fall where they may. Whoever happens to be the next president will have to deal with this. Okay, so that's frequently done. But it was almost immediately pointed out by some of the observers that this is a real setup. Like if you anticipate Trump's defeat, then what you're talking about here is another gigantic financial crisis being dumped on the lap of an incoming and brand new Democratic president, which is par for the course. I mean, that's basically what happens to Democratic presidents. That is, of course, a consequence of the fact that the tough-talking, deficit-hawk Republicans, whenever they elect a president, consistently explode the deficit and the debt and have to have the debt ceiling raised, and we reach new record levels of deficit spending, even though they campaigned on coming in with fiscal discipline, and then a Democrat comes into office and has to clean these things up because apparently we're still programmed to believe that things like the federal debt matter. and it makes moderates nervous. So Democrats take care of the moderates and make the hard choices required. If you believe that this is a goal that's required, they make the hard choices required to put things right, or on the downward path, a downward trajectory for the federal debt. So, this basically sets that up. If you anticipate the defeat of Donald Trump, then fine, a Democrat will have to take care of it. If you anticipate a Trump victory, then I guess it's fine too, because LOL YOLO, nothing matters, and the president will, either ignore it again or have the debt ceiling raised again, because if you don't, I might nuke Afghanistan, or I don't know what kind of threats he might be using. I might nuke California, for that matter. No one knows exactly where he'll go with this. Or could be that my longstanding prediction that he finally mints the coin. Maybe that'll happen. And he mints a couple extras. One for Ivanka, one for himself, another one for Jared because he's not Ivanka, and maybe one for the other boys. Who knows? Tiffany, here's $1, whatever. Consider yourself lucky. Maybe that's what's going on. So this is a discussion that began with the deal on the debt ceiling. And, let's see. Gentleson has another comment. Someone else says, what do we have? Dogs in politics. How do you like that? Politics Dogs is the address of the Twitter feed here. Commenting, wow, even in the exceedingly remote possibility that McConnell declined to take advantage of that is forcing some sort of crisis on the debt ceiling in 2021 for leverage in passing something that either Trump or a Democratic president didn't want done. He would use the debt ceiling to do it. Even in the exceedingly remote possibility that McConnell declined to take advantage of that, he'd be quickly replaced by someone who would. That's a good point. Gentleson responding here, this is right. Let's say McConnell loses and Dems retake the majority in 2020. Republicans saw relentless obstruction work wonders against Obama. Since then, their incentive structure has only grown to reward obstruction more. They would double down. And as he says later on, that first tweet we read, I've been asking around for defenses of this deal, and the main rationale being offered is that top Democrats just don't think McConnell would weaponize the debt ceiling against the Democratic president in 2021. We saw him block Garland with our own eyes. It's as bad as it looks. Okay. I guess he's also noting the initial tweet in this thread, Trump announcing the deal that was struck, and then his response to Trump saying in 2011, Republicans used the debt ceiling to cripple Obama and impose trillions in cuts. Today, Dem leaders agreed to lift the debt ceiling for the remainder of Trump's presidency, but reimpose it in 2021 when Republicans could again use it to cripple a Democratic president. So yeah, is that a problem? And that's where Taniel and his comment chime in. He's saying it's hard to believe that anyone could say such a thing, or he says utter such a thing. But we just read that Politico article with prominent Dems decrying the idea of playing revenge with judicial process as though it's about revenge rather than protecting equal rights or public services. So no, I'm not optimistic. What was that about? What story was that? That was this one, which I'll open up and take a look at in just a minute. But of course, I mentioned that there was a Brian Beutler comment on it, and he was commenting about the Politico article, which we'll read, in which, and he says, people aren't mad that McConnell stole the Garland seat because their feelings are hurt. They're mad because unless and until that theft is remedied, the court will mete out illegitimate injustice that hurts regular people for decades. Well, a good point. And what's it in counter to? Well, that's the point of opening up the article. We'll have to read it here, but you get the sense of where this is going to end up. And then I'll make my own comments on it. The article is by Marianne Levine and Burgess Everett. We've seen Everett's name a little bit in the past. Levine, I think, is new to me. But here's the deal. Headline is, Democrats weigh vengeance on Republicans over judges. That actually sounds kind of promising, but it turns out not to be the case. It's that they weigh and reject the idea of vengeance. Liberals and centrists says the subheader, are debating whether to embrace the GOP's hardline approach or restore the historic bipartisan traditions of the Senate. Ah, that is sweet. Well, don't do it. Well, anyway, here's the story. Republicans are steamrolling Democrats on judges. We know this. Jonas told us as much, right? But the question of whether to be as cutthroat as the GOP is already splitting the party as the 2020 campaign ramps up. The left has been radicalized by the Republican offensive, with activists and several presidential candidates eager for payback against Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell the next time the Democrats take power. But centrist Democrats and a handful of institutionalists still roaming the Capitol want the party to set a different example than the GOP, not mimic it. When you think about Merrick Garland and what McConnell has done to the Senate, there's a lot of feelings of vengeance and revenge, said Senator Dick Durbin, the number 2 Senate Democrat. We just hope the better angels of our nature will prevail. Oh well. The party doesn't have to settle the question just yet, but if Democrats take the Senate and the White House in 2020, their choice will determine whether the party can begin to reshape the federal judiciary after President Donald Trump and the GOP spent years stocking it with young conservatives. And if Democrats do decide to embrace the playbook deployed by their Republican counterparts, it will ensure the Senate's unique traditions continue their long erosion. I wish we could also get back to 60 votes, said Senator Doug Jones of Alabama, who needs to appeal to Republicans to win re-election next year. It won't work with them, but okay. We need to aim higher. We need to get back to that. Restoring the 60-vote threshold to confirm nominees would make it even harder to bend the judiciary leftward, and also you will get no agreement to do it. But liberals, meanwhile, are weighing whether to gut the few bipartisan norms still standing by expanding the size of the Supreme Court and completely eliminating the ability of senators to have a say on judges from their home states. Of course, that's already been completely eliminated, so it wouldn't be Democrats doing it, but whatever. It's just one of a few errors in this piece. Democrats should not play by a different set of rules from Republicans, argues Senator Elizabeth Warren, a 2020 candidate, in case you didn't know that, and a member of the Democratic leadership. We can't live in a world where the Republicans twist everything their way, whether they're in the majority or the minority, and the Democrats just keep trotting along. That's not working. Democrats are still seething over McConnell's decision to block Garland, Barack Obama's Supreme Court nominee, from even getting a hearing. They're also mourning what they say is a breakdown of other Senate customs, particularly on the so-called blue slip process. Heard of that, haven't you? That allows each senator a chance to veto, more or less, nominations for judges in their home states. McConnell has prioritized the courts in a way that's essentially unheard of. First by stopping Obama from filling vacancies, then by prioritizing them over difficult legislative gambits. He's also unilaterally changed the Senate rules through the nuclear option to speed up confirmation of Trump's judges. Even as Trump captured the nation's attention last week with his attacks on 4 Democratic congresswomen, the Senate quietly confirmed its record-setting 43rd Circuit judge. Incredibly, there are now only 4 circuit court vacancies, and Republicans are shifting to fill the lower 111 district court vacancies. And what they mean, of course, by prioritizing it that seemed kind of awkward, right? But prioritizing it over doing any legislative work. They haven't passed any real serious legislation at all. They've just been spending all their time on these nominations. The aggressive push has left Democrats smarting and powerless until they can grab back power. They concede that there's not much they can do right now to stop Republicans from putting their stamp on the federal judiciary, but the party is tossing out ideas both within the Senate and on the 2020 trail for how to reverse Trump's influence on the courts, ranging from changes to the Supreme Court to pledging to only nominate judges who would uphold the landmark abortion ruling in Roe v. Wade, and other ideas, to pressing conservative groups like the Judicial Crisis Network to reveal their donors. I don't consider it vengeance, said Senator Mazie Hirono. I consider it doing something about the reality of what's happening to our courts. Well, that's a better way of putting it, isn't it? Some Democrats see the prospect of changes to Senate tradition as a balancing act. Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota, also a 2020 candidate and member of the Judiciary Committee, blamed Republicans for changing Senate rules and called many of Trump's nominees really problematic. When asked if she would consider rotating or expanding the Supreme Court, Klobuchar said she was open to looking at those, but also said that as president she hopes to put forward good, strong nominees that are going to follow the law and get bipartisan support. Well, that sounds very nice. We'll continue with this article and its mistakes after this. Hi, everybody. It's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Gotta open up a few items here and see if I can keep them available for later on. But continuing on here, what did I just see fly by here? Senator Ensign, apparently now formally filing for divorce, in case you need the update on that. And former Senator Ensign, who resigned amid ethics investigations in 2011, finalized a divorce, I guess not filed for, but finalized a divorce from his wife of 31 years last week. Ensign's political career started to unravel after revelations that he had an affair with Cindy Hampton, the wife of his Senate administrative aide, Doug Hampton. Ensign dismissed Doug Hampton from his Senate office after the affair came to light, and Ensign's parents made a $96,000 payment to the Hampton family that Doug Hampton said was a severance payment. You remember all of that. Murky finances. Oh, just a bit of a Brett Kavanaugh problem there. Anyway, just thought I would note that, and I guess that's coming to a resolution, but family values, yada, yada. Please look the other way. Okay. At any rate, we were in the middle of Politico's article about how Senate Democrats, dismayingly enough, view the question of how to respond to Republican chaos and bulldozing on judges. Some Democrats, as we had noted, see the prospect of changes as a balancing act. Amy Klobuchar, chief among them. But those who would lead the process, in the Senate anyway, say it makes little sense to make big plans until they win a majority. Well, it makes little sense to talk about them in public anyway. It does make good sense to make them ahead of time. Our first job is to take back the Senate, and then we'll discuss everything else, said Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, who has no reason to spark a divisive fight within his caucus. Senator Dianne Feinstein, who is in line to be Judiciary Chair if Democrats win the Senate, said she hasn't thought about it because that jinxes it for sure. Well, that's a little superstitious, but she probably has thought about it. She's just not going to tell you about it. I'm not into payback, though, she says. Feinstein has signaled her reluctance to duplicating the GOP approach. I'm not into payback. I never have been. And I'd just do it as fairly as I possibly could. That's all. I hope that's cover for something, but I fear that it's not. Whether to sideline Republicans has never been discussed, much to our credit. I don't know what they're trading the credit for, but I guess it's moral credit. It's just not winning them any majorities anytime soon. Well, maybe something else will. Feinstein's perspective is a source of frustration among progressive groups, which say that Democrats have conceded too much to Republicans on judges. Brian Fallon, executive director of Demand Justice, a liberal advocacy organization focused on the courts, said that Feinstein should be using her leverage now as the top Democrat on the Judiciary Committee to remind Republicans that Democrats will borrow their tactics if and when they return to power. After all, that was the Republican approach to things, and they now hold the majority. When the Republicans were in the minority, they said, make no mistake, we will absolutely leverage the nuclear option should you use it against us now. We will absolutely do this and more. And then, lo and behold, for whatever reason, they were delivered control of the Senate, and then they did do that thing. So there's a pretty good argument out there that that's actually a successful tactic. It works. Of course, they may say, well, sure, it works with Republican voters, and it might not work with Democratic voters because, I don't know, I say so, and I'm a Democrat and I'm elected, and so you have to listen to me. It's entirely possible. Of course, by the way, I mean, that eliminates, or rather, that leaves out the history of the nuclear option and where it came from. I mean, this happened during the debates on filibuster reform in 2009, 10, 11, all the way up through 13, when Democrats sometimes fretted or Republicans said, well, we'll use it against you. If you use it against us, we're going to leverage it against you. And, of course, the counter to that was, well, you were always going to use it, and you would likely use it whether we use it now or not. I know you might think it's just speculation. It was correct speculation, but you might think it's just speculation for us to have said, say, in 2012 or 2013, before the use of the so-called nuclear option, to make changes in the filibuster or applications of the filibuster rule and precedents that grow out of it. You might have said, well, Republicans will certainly, even if we don't do this now, Republicans will certainly use it when it becomes necessary for them. Whether that's, a Trump administration is swept into office thanks to the illegal coordination with the Russians and Jim Comey's interference with his stupid letter, whatever, and the Senate majority in conjunction with that will steamroller everything. And if Democrats were to block Trump's judicial nominees, they would simply trigger the nuclear option then and do what we might refuse to do now, and have that many more vacancies available to fill because of their willingness to use the rules to block us and then undo the rules to make way for themselves. Yes, that was always a possibility. But if you consider that too speculative, I very frequently would answer people by saying, well, whose plan is this nuclear option? Where did this thing come from? And it's a good reminder that in 2004, it was Republicans who came up with the nickname for it and who borrowed the procedure from earlier filibuster reform fights, not centering specifically around judicial appointments, but rather around the legislative filibuster. But in 2004, they revived this idea that had laid dormant at that point, for, 75, 85, 30 years. It hadn't been discussed. And they brought it back to the fore and passed it around as a plan. And ultimately, they were pushed off of it by the Gang of 14. I guess now, are we done with them now? Are they all gone? I can't recall. Was Lindsey Graham part of that or not? I can't remember. Anyway, the point is that they were pushed off of that by the agreement among the Gang of 14, but they were absolutely ready to pull that trigger. And the fact that less than 10 years, 8 years later, Democrats eventually employed that procedure which Republicans explicitly threatened to use against them. And even the Gang of 14's agreement countenanced the use of the nuclear option. They didn't say that it was illegitimate or couldn't work or shouldn't be done. They just said, we agree not to do it right now during the 200 which was it? I can't remember what it was. Was it the 109th Congress that they were made the agreement for? Anyway, first of all, it was a short-term agreement, and second of all, it didn't delegitimize the use of the procedure. And so, as far as the threats go, Republicans are going to get Democrats back in 2015, 2016, for their use of the nuclear option in 2013. Well, the real revenge was the use of the nuclear option in 2013 to get back at Republican threats to use it in 2004 and 2005. You put this on the table. The fact that you undid your threat is your problem, not ours. But the correct consequences of making a threat like that is usually said, well, it'll come back to bite you. Well, it did. You took a second bite in blocking Merrick Garland and then using the nuclear option in 2017 to clear the way for Gorsuch and later Kavanaugh. But, somehow that first round gets left out of the recounting. Something else gets left out in this article, too. Let's continue with this. So where were we? Feinstein saying, gee whiz, we ought not to do such things. Brian Fallon saying, gee whiz, you really ought to. She won't say that is Feinstein. She won't threaten that because she wants to preserve the option of punching ourselves in the face again and let Senator Graham veto President Warren or President Harris's judicial picks, Fallon said, referring to Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman Lindsey Graham. Another issue that's talked about less often on a national stage, but is crucial on Capitol Hill, is the blue slip process. And it is crucial, which is all the more reason why it's so surprising that they don't actually cover it very well here. Republicans have all but done away with that senatorial prerogative for circuit court judges who represent multiple states, prompting a stark increase in no votes from Democratic senators among the rank and file and presidential hopefuls. Democrats are unsure whether they would restore that tradition to the appellate courts should they regain power, or perhaps do Republicans one better and scrap the practice for lower-level courts too. My first instinct is to say we should go back to the blue slip, but it's hard to say that after many years of Leader McConnell exercising his authority in ways that have been previously unexplored. It's a nice way of saying it. It says Senator Brian Schatz of Hawaii. It's tough to think that if and when we take the Senate back, that we're supposed to think better of it and restore bipartisan traditions. Other Democrats like Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut are more insistent about wanting to return to Senate tradition on blue slips. It ensures that judicial nominees respect the character and views of the areas where they serve, and that the local bar has a say or impact because they know the nominees better than anyone else, said Blumenthal, a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Republicans are skeptical that Democrats would even consider restoring the Senate's judicial traditions and have attacked them for being the first to go nuclear. A Democratic majority eliminated the 60-vote threshold for most judicial nominees in 2013. McConnell triggered the nuclear option on Supreme Court justices just 4 years later. When asked if Senate Democrats would restore blue slip for circuit judges, Graham replied, absolutely not. They're the ones that changed the rules to go to the majority vote, Graham said. We couldn't get 60 votes for anybody for the circuit court and the Supreme Court. Those days are over. Just one Democratic senator remains who voted against the rules change in 2013, Senator Joe Manchin, who echoes Jones's call to restore the 60-vote threshold. While that's unlikely, the sharp divide within the caucus shows how difficult it will be to get 50 Democrats to endorse anything if they win back a narrow Senate majority. It's toxic now, no matter what part the party is, Manchin said. 51 votes is dysfunctional. 60 votes gets this place where it's supposed to be and lets the minority participate and forces agreement, and now we don't have that. But in fact, of course, 60 votes is what made the Senate dysfunctional for so many years. But okay, let's just ignore that. But what really got ignored in all of this, despite the interest in blue slips, is the fact that we have already been through this fight. There isn't room to question whether or not the restoration of the blue slip procedure by Democrats when they control the Senate would be fruitless and a self-inflicted wound that would, and something that would simply be undone again by Republicans when they came back into power, because we've already been through that. We did that already. I can't really understand like where the idea that there something else might result would even come from, because like I said, this is something that has already happened. So I have a great deal of difficulty understanding why they are ignoring the fact that there's actual history on this subject, that we've been through it, and there's just no question involved. I'm not certain why that would leave it out. So I thought that was a pretty huge omission from consideration of the article. It didn't make any sense that they didn't mention the fact that when Republicans were first in charge in recent years of everything, they had the majority, and Orrin Hatch, when Orrin Hatch was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, he absolutely did. I mean, it's a matter of just fact. He eliminated the blue slip rule, well, at least partially. The old blue slip rule, of course, used to be that you had to get the blue slips back from both home state senators in order to proceed to a hearing. And Democrats began to use the blue slip process to not, they began not returning blue slips, so that according to the Senate norms, no hearing would go forward for judges where blue slips were withheld. And Orrin Hatch, I guess, ran into that problem where there was a judicial nominee from a state from which there was one Republican and one Democratic senator, and the Democratic senator wasn't returning the blue slip, and that was frustrating to Orrin Hatch. Why should we give Democrats a veto on going ahead with the president's appointees? The president is entitled to his appointees when the president is a Republican. So Orrin Hatch said, all right, you only need one blue slip. Okay. I mean, you can do that. And they did. And they went ahead and they installed these judges. And that was that. During that time, Pat Leahy, who had been chairman of the Judiciary Committee beforehand, insisted, we're going to take back the majority, and I'm going to be chairman of the Judiciary Committee again. And when I am going to restore the blue slip rule. I think it was really super important, and it maintained a balance in the Senate. All the things that senators are saying in this article, the Blumenthal is saying, Manchin is saying, it encourages compromise. It's part of the stability of the way the Senate works. And Leahy did it. And he restored the blue slip rule, and Republicans just stopped returning their blue slips, and Leahy just sat there saying, this is so frustrating. And that's how we got to the point where there were so many judicial vacancies. We couldn't move any of these judges because we had insisted on restoring the rules that were supposed to restore the balance and functionality of the Senate. And we saw what happened. Reality was that the balance and functionality of the Senate was not restored, and the Senate sat there paralyzed and couldn't move any judges. Then, when Republicans took control of the Senate again, and took control, therefore, of the Senate Judiciary Committee, what did they do? Well, they weren't going to sit there and use Pat Leahy's stupid rule that would allow Democrats to paralyze Republican president. They just said, forget it, and eliminated it. And do you need, you need one blue slip? Well, maybe they were getting, eventually they began dealing with judicial nominees that came from states represented by 2 Democrats, and neither one of them would return the blue slip. So that was no longer good enough. So they just said, to hell with it. Blue slips don't mean anything. We're not going to sit here and let you defeat this president's nominees because we're from the same party. And the blue slip rule was gone again. So it's like, it's not something we have to wonder about. You don't have to ask, well, what would happen if we did go back and try to restore Senate norms? We have your answer. Nothing happens. You lose and Republicans win. And then when it's their turn to come back into power, they simply undo your undoing of what they did last time. It's not something that needs to be pondered. We don't have to figure out what might happen. It already happened. And the fact that it gets zero mention in the article is a pretty amazing oversight. You would think after spending that much time on discussing the partial history of blue slips, I mean, it wasn't even that long ago, and many of the same players are still here. Is it Orrin Hatch's retirement that makes it impossible to remember that there's real honest-to-God history on this thing? I guess another thing I would add, by the way, to Daniel's comment about this thing, and I'm going off on a slightly different tangent, but I guess still staying within the topics of the week, when he said, it's just dismaying to see Democrats speaking this way and talking this way about discussing it, and as Brian addressed here, discussing the idea of restoring the ability of the federal courts to fairly and at least maybe possibly occasionally somewhat objectively consider serious points of law that have to do with civil rights and really just about everything, but I mean affecting the lives of hundreds of millions of people, that to cast that in terms of, well, it's really all just revenge. You're talking about revenge against the Republicans, which is just not a respectable end here. That's not what senators do. We're the grown-ups in the room. We don't play the revenge game. But that's a very conscious framing, and an incorrect one, and a manipulative one. And it reminded me also of the last time that we were on the impeachment merry-go-round that didn't catch on quite as well. Last time it was warranted when we were discussing the impeachment of George W. Bush for any number of things, including as detainee policies, torture, warrantless wiretapping, you name it. There were any number of things, but there were lots of Democrats who just couldn't wait to adopt the Republican framing that talking about impeaching George W. Bush was just tit for tat. That was like the famous phrase for this. Tit for tat for the Clinton impeachment. You're just looking to get revenge for the Clinton impeachment. You don't have a real case against W. And I expected Republicans to say that, not just because it was disingenuous, but because it was in their interest. What I didn't expect was for Democrats to sign on to that framing and say, I'm not for crazy stuff like impeachment because that'll be seen as tit for tat, because I have just seen Republicans say it was tit for tat. You didn't have to agree with that. You could have said, no, it's not tit for tat. When a president is torturing people and warrantlessly wiretapping domestically and holding people indefinitely and claiming the ability to ignore portions of laws that he doesn't like with executive signing statements, and advancing the stupid unitary executive theory, and refusing, for instance, let's say, to comply with congressional subpoenas. As others have noted, that was one of the articles of impeachment waiting in the wings for Richard Nixon, but that never became necessary. I don't know whether it would have made any difference to have just gone ahead with the impeachment at that point. But of course, for the good of the nation and get past our long national nightmare and national healing and everything, everybody decided, well, he's resigned and we don't have to impeach him. But as we've said on the show a number of times, that doesn't really end the question. And maybe they should have gone ahead with it so that there wasn't any historical question about whether or not you could be impeached for ignoring congressional subpoenas. But not that it would matter now, but, whatever. It just, like I said, it reminded me of the fact that Democrats have done lasting damage to themselves and the nation by foolishly adopting Republican framing on extremely important issues of constitutional law, and did so in an effort to appear reasonable, which is just on its face not reasonable. I just don't think anybody really thinks that what makes a reasonable Democrat? Well, it's a one that adopts Republican ways of thinking about things. No, that's what a Republican thinks a reasonable Democrat is. Democrats might have a different idea about what makes a reasonable Democrat. But apparently we're caught in the same cycle, and that may have something to do with the fact that it's almost exactly the same players playing the game this time. The people who said that a W impeachment would be tit for tat are still in office in large part, and now saying the same thing about doing about the various options available to Democrats, a new Democratic majority and a Democratic president in 2021 with respect to trying to put that president's stamp on the judiciary. That too will just be tit for tat. I find it pretty amazing. And really, honestly, one thing about tit for tat is it's predictable. It's pretty stable. And those are all the things that they're looking to restore somehow magically, with going back to an era that's now so far in the past that it wouldn't make any particular sense. We're way past the old-time Senate traditions, but maybe this is a good argument for generational change, and lots of supporters of that concept will be excited to hear it endorsed here, I suppose. But, there it is. It's a long, rambling commentary on this stuff, but this has this one article and this one subject of what to do when Democrats take back control in the Senate and how to deal with issues before the Judiciary Committee has implications for everybody in the country, and pretty major ones at that. And the idea that we shouldn't be publicly thinking it through now because what? A jinx? Really? Okay. Yeah, we don't really actually work like that. We prefer science and all that stuff. Yeah, well, same thing, I think, when it comes to jinxes. All right. Let's see. Other things that require some discussion here before we cut out. I guess we got to at least make mention of the fact we have a fairly disturbing development, yet another one, underway in the last day or so. We've got various reports, and I've just picked up one of them here. For example, report-wise, Ryan Cooper, national correspondent for The Week, noting that ICE and Customs and Border Patrol have in their custody a Dallas-born United States citizen, an 18-year-old American, whom they have kept incarcerated for 3 weeks, even after his mother presented a valid birth certificate. We got a pretty serious problem here. Reported by the Dallas News. Ryan's characterization of it, I even lightened it here. He says ICE and CBP kidnapped an 18-year-old American citizen and have kept him incarcerated for 3 weeks even after his mother presented a valid birth certificate. The story here in the Dallas News I'll include for your review. I won't have time to get through it, but I mean, look, that's the basics of it. They picked up somebody that looked like he might be of, I don't know, Central American heritage, and said, you're an illegal immigrant because you can't prove to us that you're a citizen. And there's a good point here, as others have made. Who carries the proof of citizenship around with them? It's just not a thing that's done. Simon Rosenberg pointing out, even if you have your driver's license on you, it doesn't establish your citizenship on it. So what if you were stopped and detained? And how would you prove that you're legally here? What if DHS rejects your documents? Fake news, right? What do you do at that point? And what if they make you go to court to be freed? Because it's happening right now, as he says, in America. And he correctly points out that's not a power that can be in Trump's hands. There's no reason to believe that we can trust him and his administration with extraordinary powers like this, but he does claim them. And he does so, by order of, here included in his tweet is a reference to David Leopold's tweet here. Breaking news, Trump to expand expedited removal. That's what they're calling it. Like enhanced interrogation, we now have expedited removal, e.g., deportation without the right to see an immigration judge throughout the U.S. could have a devastating consequences on everything here, subjecting millions to immediate detention and deportation, and I guess U.S. citizens included, because everyone just insists that can't happen. Well, you'll just show your birth certificate, right? Just show it. Well, mom showed up and showed it. Hasn't had an effect, so we'll be investigating that. I'm sure people will be talking about that all week. And I'll bet there's a pretty good reason to believe it might even come up next here on Netroots Radio when Justice takes the mic for the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Let's take a look at what he's got on tap here. Mother Jones's David Korn takes apart the lying hack from the Washington Examiner, Siraj Hashmi, for repeating the right-wing lie about the origins of the Russia investigation. The Department of Agriculture wants to kick over 3 million working-class people off food stamps to make a conservative Minnesota millionaire happy. The new Trump administration rule lets ICE rapidly deport, there it is, undocumented immigrants without due process.
From Daily
and maybe
Coos
you
Radio
and your family,
on
too.
netrootsradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show.
With David Waldman.
And look, he's on Dan Crenshaw's case, too. No one can really dispute Dan Crenshaw's wholly misleading attack on the minimum wage because he lost an eye in the war. Internationally, he's got news here, too. Huawei Technologies secretly helped North Korea build and maintain its wireless network. Did you know they even had one?